Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. Today is Jordan Peterson Thursday, and we're going to be discussing rule number 6. So let me hand it over to Roger and Claire. Go ahead.
All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. So today we're going to be talking about a pretty serious topic. It's going to be Rule 6, which is set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. And in this chapter, Peterson is essentially going to try to explore how humans can reach a level of resentment that can become so dire that people don't just become nihilistic, but actually become function against being itself, against existence, and why criticizing conditions outside of you is a step in that direction that, if you don't manage it well, can lead you to some pretty dark areas. And that's kind of what this whole chapter is going to explore. But to start, he starts the first section called A Religious Problem. And essentially in this section, he's trying to point out that the psychological pattern that you find in a lot of mass murders and a lot of really big antisocial behavior is the same pattern that's been mapped on since some of our earliest biblical stories, such as Cain and Abel. And to kind of start us off, just to get a general idea of what it is we're talking about, I do want to jump in and read one of the first quotes he has from the Columbine shooter, because what he points out is it's hard to say that these people are religious, but the problem that they have is being held at a religious level. And the Columbine shooter wrote, "The human race isn't worth fighting for, only worth killing. Give the earth back to the animals. They deserve it indefinitely more than we do. Nothing means anything anymore." So just to get a general mindset of what this chapter is going to be like and what kind of topics we're going to be talking about, I have Aaron, Joe, and Claire. These are going to be our panelists. And does anyone want to start us off with thoughts on just even that first quote?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is the chapter that we can go back to when we think about things that truly plague humans, like addiction. I think this is the one where I think about my friends who I know that are deep within issues of addiction. This is the chapter that I go back to for them. When people have serious life-threatening illnesses, this is kind of a chapter to go back to for those. When anyone is faced with that kind of unalterable suffering that comes with life, this chapter of setting your house in perfect order before criticizing the world is meant to be sort of an antidote to that. So he's going to start to kind of go through and break down some of those different types of sufferings and what tools we can use to mitigate those. But I think just to set the tone, as you did, this is when he's really wanting us to come to the table and grapple with some of humans' most proclivities toward evil. And what does that darkness really look like?
Yeah, just to add on to what Claire's saying is that I think of just despondency. I see desperation, fear, and depression, and it kind of leads us to like how those fears can lead to evil thought. It's kind of what, Yoda was saying in Star Wars, that fear does lead to the dark side eventually, to use a movie cliche. But it's not that like transparent how that connection happens, and I think Peterson does a good job of outlining it.
Yeah, and also I do enjoy the fact that he kind of really takes his time to try to paint a full picture of what kind of mindset he's trying to get to. And it really, if you guys have watched other Peterson talks, Peterson views this as a form of shadow integration, right? When he says, if you read their journals of the Columbine shooting, if you read the Gulag Archipelago, the way you should read it shouldn't be, oh, that crazy person over there did some horrible stuff. Man, what a crappy person. It's like, that's not how you should perceive it at all. How you should perceive it is, that's something that I am also capable of. If that person's capable of it, that means they're on the same platform as me. That means I'm capable of it. That means I could get to a point, to a level in my current life where I start viewing the world exactly like he is right now. And kind of to give you a general idea of just how dark and heavy that is, I'm going to read another quote from Columbine, because I feel like before this talk, I read the entire journal.
Yeah.
And yeah, I feel like you could take any paragraph from that and it's chilling. But he has one more quote, and then and it's, if you recall your history, the Nazis came up with the final solution to the Jewish problem: kill them all. Well, in case you haven't figured it out, I say, kill mankind. No one should survive. So like this true hatred for existence, and this true idea that to exist is kind of like a complete flip of moralities. To exist is so unfair and so not just meaningless, because meaningless doesn't give it a value, but so negative that it deserves and in fact should be destroyed. And
that's kind of the radical part about, or the way he wants to start off this chapter is, he's saying not only is life so insufferable that we should want to kill ourselves, but we should all want to kill each other. Like, he's pushing us up to the wall in order, he's intentionally pushing us in that way to get us to feel this truth, which is that life is very hard, and that we are not the architects of that hardness, and we're not in control of that. And so I think he's okay with bringing in these examples like he's done of the Gulag and of Columbine, to show that sort of juxtaposition.
I just want to add one thing to what Roger was saying. I've seen other Peterson interviews where he says like the most chilling thing of the Nazis is the fact that they were human. I think in modern society, we've gotten to this point where that's completely outside the realm of human behavior. That can't happen again. But I think just living with that startling feeling at all times that there's a Nazi or a Columbine killer in potentially within all of us is something that takes like drastic action on behalf of the individual, because we think that we think it's like an alien subspecies that would commit these kind of atrocities. But I think having that stark reminder that these things were committed by humans is something that we need to walk with every day.
And an interesting point to that is actually where he quotes like, everyone is destined for pain and slated for destruction. And that we're kind of we all live with this reality. So now what are we going to do with it? Are we going to harness and use resentment and let it overtake us? Or we can challenge ourselves to be something better.
And he kind of that's also what I like about this chapter is the first half, he just keeps going deeper and darker, right? Because he kind of explains this, like, look, when we're the victims of tragedy or just bad luck or, all the different horrors that life can offer you, we're also faced with the horror and pain of our own limitations. We're faced with the fact that we're probably not strong enough to protect ourselves. We die. Life isn't fair. Our circumstances aren't chosen by us, and normally we don't have much control out of them. And we're kind of left to the whims of chance and, whatever reality puts us to. And so, like, because that is the human condition, it is extremely tempting to just be mad at the world, to be mad at the fact that is the game we're all in, right? And, I really like how he kind of sums it up, that like, no matter how you dress it up, no matter whether you think it's like, oh, why is God so unfair? Or why is this reality so unfair? Or why is this system so unfair? Or why is the state so unfair? It always boils down to, why do bad things happen to good people? Right? Why do people that don't deserve to be hurt, why are they normally the ones that get hurt? Why is suffering so prevalent and, so unevenly distributed, right? No one that deserves it gets it. And it always feels like this world is almost, at certain points can feel as though the whole world is against you. And this idea of like, well, who do we blame? Like, where's the blame supposed to go once you're in those kinds of situations, right?
And you know, Roger, and it's also just to add on is that if you feel that you live in a completely unjust universe, then you say to yourself, I don't have to follow any justice myself. And I think a lot of people have wrongly taken the liberty that because the world is fundamentally has no rules, that I myself don't have to follow those rules either. And that can lead to a very dark path.
Right. Right. And that's another thing. I think he might talk about it later on the meaningful chapter, but where he notes that, yeah, look, you have two options when it comes to reality. You can see as nothing matters and then see it as somewhat of a tragedy. It's like, but there's also an advantage. You have no responsibility. Nothing matters, then nothing actually matters, right? And if that truly is the case, then these murders and all these horrible things we're talking about, there isn't any actual value to them. We don't like them because we don't like to die, but like, so what? Like, it's no actual value outside of that, right? It's simply a perceptive, prescribed value to it. But yeah, I do like his solution, but I'll leave that for the next chapter. And I did want to read this quote of just how terrible the human condition can be by reading the Tolstoy quote, which I feel is a great idea, because essentially Tolstoy kind of, once he's philosophizing about, well, it seems that life is meaningless and people suffer unfairly, and how could you not describe this experience as in most ways evil, right, and in an unfair way? And I love this quote of, my position was terrible. I knew that I could find nothing in the way of rational knowledge except the denial of life. And in faith, I could find nothing except the denial of reason. And this was even more impossible than the denial of life. According to rational knowledge, it followed that life is evil, and people know it. They do not have to live, yet they have lived and they do live, just as I myself had lived, even though I had known for a long time that life is meaningless and evil. So it's this idea that once we've kind of developed science and it destroyed our mythological narrative of God, it's like, oh, well, then why are we suffering, right? Why are we going through all this hell? And it's like the rational aspect of ourselves undermined the very justification that we use to kind of push through this, this trudge of life, right? It's like all through all the hardships.
Yeah, I mean, and like not only does it harness this like resentment for life itself, but I also think that there's a message overall for this chapter, is that it has a way of manifesting itself in very subtle ways. And these are just extreme cases where, if in certain cases it can undermine our relationships, marriages, and I mean by what I mean by that is meaning resentment in general. Resentment for being is just the extreme end of that. But resentment in general has a way of undermining everything that we are and
Right.
everything that we can be. So that's a really critical point, because it also prevents not only he distinguishes between two things. It's not only that you're willing to kill yourself at certain points, that you're willing to kill other people in addition to that. And that's where he kind of goes to another level. And he says, it's not only the hell with me, it's the hell with the humanity. And that's pure evil.
Right. Yeah, no. And bouncing right off of that, because that's exactly where I was going next, is that the next quote that's also from Tolstoy is, he's like, all right, well, look, we don't have a God that can save us in the traditional sense, or at least Tolstoy's saying this. And our rationality, right, if we want to break this down just purely rational, seems like this would just be a bad idea to play this game, right? Like, people are just going to be born and suffer and die, and it's, for what are we even working for here? And then he has his 4 little solutions, which are exactly to what Joe's talking about, that the idea of there's 4 solutions that he comes up with, right? And it's sorry, let me find them.
I think, right. You want me? I have them if you want me to.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Tolstoy.
So Tolstoy has 4 solutions. One is mindless pleasure. So you're just living for the next great meal, going to the bar with friends. The second is childlike ignorance. So I guess you're just turning a blind eye to the world, or you just don't know. And maybe some of us are not, deep-seated philosophers and are thinking about like the nature of things too deeply. So they kind of just assume the best intentions. The third is the knowledge that death is better than life, but there's a fear of acting upon it. And I kind of characterize this as sort of a nihilistic philosophy or constant suicidal ideation, as would be described in psychological terms. And the fourth would be suicide. And obviously, if someone goes ahead with suicide, they're not around long enough to actually be a proponent of that idea. But for some reason, Tolstoy thinks that this is like the bravest of the solutions because it's the most self-actualizing or the most congruent with reality.
Right. And like the third one kind of hits me hard where he kind of says this, like, yeah, the people that drag out life because they're too scared to kill themselves, essentially. It's like the cowards are too scared to kill themselves to just trudge through it. And yeah, to jump off from the quote that I was originally going to read, but I realized didn't have the 4 rules, is that the last one, the one that, are the ones that should kill life or go against life. Only unusually strong and logically consistent people act in this manner. Having realized all the stupidity of the joke that is being played on us, and seeing that the blessings of the dead are greater than those of the living, and that it is better to not exist, they act and put an end to the stupid joke. They use any means of doing it: a rope around the neck, water, a knife in the heart, a train. And what I love about Peterson, because of course he says this, is the very next sentence is, Tolstoy wasn't pessimistic enough. The idea being, as Joe alluded to earlier, it's not, if you take this idea seriously, a truly meaningless life idea, it isn't just that life is meaningless for you and that you're going through suffering. It's that life is meaningless for everyone, and it shouldn't happen at all, right? It should just be destroyed. And once you take that view, it's an antenatal or anti-being view, that's where you get into the mass shooter philosophy, where you get the justification for that, the rationalization for why that's actually not a totally insane idea, right? There's an internal logic that's functioning within that.
Also,
And so he says, if you're suffering, well, that's the norm. People are limited and life is tragic. If your suffering is unbearable, however, and you're starting to become corrupted, here's something to think about.
definitely, I just want to add on as well that perhaps becoming like a mass shooter is the end result. But once you kind of adopt that philosophy that life is meaningless, there's little steps along the way.
Mm-hmm.
Like someone, $20 falls out of someone's pocket and you just pocket and say, no one's looking, I'm not going to get caught. So I think that like the end result might take you to a very drastic situation. But I think even just adapting the philosophy of nihilism, even to a small degree, can impact your day-to-day behavior.
That's
Right.
a great point. Yeah, I mean, because people will lie, cheat, and steal, and that has a way of building up. If that's your approach to life, then you're only going to get more angry. So that it turns into the mass shooter or even to a suicidal point.
And here he gets very prescriptive because he says, okay, so there's a lot of stuff that are acts of God, but not knowing those things is a failure to prepare. And when the necessity for preparation is well known, that's sin, and that's failure to hit the mark. And the wages of sin is death. So I think that there is a heaviness here in preparing for what's to come.
Yeah, right. And that one he's talking about later about how you should view who's to blame, right? Like who should be, yeah, because what he points out first and foremost is that like this resentment because the next question is like, well, who are you supposed to blame? But first, it's like this resentment has been categorized even in the Cain and Abel story, right? Like the fact that Cain bludgeons his own brother to death, who is loved by God, to spite God. Like you can very easily read that as Cain didn't like the game. He didn't like the fact that the game was set up in a way that he wasn't doing well. And rather than bother to try to learn to adapt or learn the game or get better at it, he did the equivalent of flipping the table. Fuck your game, fuck my brother, fuck all of this, and fuck you. I don't want to play this, right? It's a full negation of everything. And Peterson's kind of, though, of course, this is why I like that he starts with this, because he starts with the extreme and he's like, all right, now let's walk it back. But he takes you all the way. He's kind of like the Virgil, takes you all the way to hell and be like, all right, well, now how do we get out? And the next section, which is the vengeance or transformation, which is alluding to the choices that you have when you do suffer trauma, I think is where we kind of start walking back. And I think that's where we start talking about, and I think someone in the chat mentioned that criminals that are first normally hurt and then hurt. And he brings up the Karl Panzram, who, when he was younger, was raped, brutalized, and betrayed as a kid, and, was naturally, obviously resentful towards the people that had abused them, and then eventually kind of generalizes that hatred to everyone else, and becomes a rapist, an arsonist, a serial killer. And for me, what the main thing you should know about this guy is something that Peterson quotes too in other interviews. His last words, right before they killed him, they asked him, like, "Do you have any last words?" And his response was, "Yes. Hurry it up, you hoser bastard. I could kill a dozen men while you're screwing around." Right? So that should give you an idea of how he perceives reality and the goals around him. Did anyone have any thoughts on that section or about those?
Just one thing I want to add about Cain and Abel. It's also this idea of spiting the creator, or
Right.
spiting the fact that you exist. So even if you don't believe in God or anything like that, you are just upset at your own existence, and that's compelling you towards evil. So it's not
Good
like
point.
that's it.
Right. Yeah. The Cain and Abel story just fits over more as a narrative and motivative structure, not religious, not in any religious sense. You don't need to have that religious meaning for it to point out to that human is acting out the same thing as Panzram when he's just trying to create as much havoc and destruction as he can manage. And yeah, I think Joe, you had said that you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say really quickly, it was interesting to use the Columbine kids and Panzram, because Panzram actually had been incarcerated into a facility as a juvenile where he was actually raped and beaten and had come out. And we'll get to the next part where, Peterson cites examples that where people have overcome that.
Go ahead and go into it if you like.
Yeah, I mean, well, in the second part of the chapter, he starts to get into whether it's vengeance or transformation. And, I like the quote that he uses from Nietzsche, where he says, "Distress, whether psychic, physical, or intellectual, need not at all produce nihilism. That is the radical rejection of value, meaning, and desirability. Such distress always permits a variety of interpretations, which meaning that we have choices that we can make." And he provides examples of somebody that is a patient of his that subsequently, had gone through something similar to Panzram, but has turned his life around to not only become an artist, but to also help other people that have been through difficult situations. Another example was the mother that had been abused, who understands the importance of motherhood. So that these events have two ways. We can go two ways with them, but these are extremes. And again, he's providing us with extremes so that in our everyday life, that there are lesser events that we allow to pass that have a way of undermining our personal relationships, in meaning that if if I have resentment and I hold resentment towards somebody else, I don't have to kill you, but I could kill the relationship. So, and these extremes are where they just go and kill people. So it has this scale, so to speak. And I think that that's a really good example to point out. But I'll let anybody else comment from that.
Yeah, and I also like how he points out that in that sense of vengeance, and he points this out with Panzram, is Panzram's path is actually pretty rational. Nobody doesn't understand it, right? As a child being abused, raped, and just tormented, and then he later goes and tries to get vengeance on the world. It's like, no, that's actually, that you can follow that path. You can see where that comes from, and that's what he points out. Is like, that's the most horrifying part. Like, right, that's the scary part. Is like, we all seem to also understand how he got there and why he did what he did. And what he points out is that, but vengeance, no matter how justified,
right,
unfortunately limits more productive behavior. And kind of this where he brings up T.S. Eliot and his character from the cocktail party. So it's a woman who's speaking to her psychiatrist and says, my life, I'm really suffering. I can't stand all the pain that I'm going through. And then adds the bit of, I just really hope it's my fault. I really hope I'm the one causing this, which, confuses the psychologist. And he asks, well, why do you want it to be your fault? Because if it's not my fault, if the world really is fully set against me, and that is the cause of my pain, then there's nothing I can do about it, right? And in this, he's highlighting the reasons why it may be better, rather than to put blame on the external world, to interpret the situation in such a way that actually empowers you and allows you to actually adapt to the problem that you're being faced with. And this is the difference between vengeance or transformation. You can either take vengeance out on the person that hurt you, but that's a pretty limited short-term strategy, right? If you're the kind of person that ended up in a situation where someone can hurt you, and then you hurt the person that hurt you, cool, great. Maybe that one person won't hurt you anymore, but now you have every other person that's still capable of hurting you, and you're still in the exact same situation that got you there. The other alternative is, if you get in a position where you're hurt, if you perceive it as, well, what did I do to end up in a situation where this was even possible? It allows you to transform into something where you're no longer in that vulnerable position anymore, or you can avoid it. And it's rather, you transform into something that can handle that problem, as opposed to just responding to the negative, to the thing that caused the problem, right? Or to the thing that you think caused the problem, which is more likely not totally accurate.
I think it's also just about how self-destructive it can be, not only to yourself, but to others. So, that's the really important point around this entire thing, is that it's not only how you're acting, but it's not only, it will impact you, and then it will impact the people around you, for better or worse, if you allow if you seek vengeance. So you're killing two people at one time. You're not just killing another person, you're killing yourself. So, it's an interesting, analogy that, again, if you're taking vengeance, it's not justice. We tend to think of it as justice because, these horrible things may have happened and I'm just going to get somebody back. But there's such a distinction between justice and vengeance, and that, vengeance is something that is always over, it doesn't restore balance, right? Mm-hmm. It's never ending. It's cyclical. You're constantly seeking it. So I think that's a really, and he really speaks to this later in the chapter, saying, look, people that have been abused in family and lines of family, that it goes away, right? So there are people that are saying at some point, stop. Like, they're not going to embrace what happened to them. just because it happened to them, they're going to do it to other people. And this
Mhm.
has, and it has societal implications. And it's really interesting to see, because you see it on a societal level, you see it on a human level, and you can even see it, he brings it up later in the chapter, on a political level.
Very true.
Yeah, and it comes down to, I think, also like a love of self in many respects. Like if you have a firm love of yourself, then committing atrocities against others just feels so repellent. Like you cannot
Right.
fathom doing that. But again, if you don't love yourself and you kind of combine that with like, oh my God, all of these injustices have happened to me in the past, it makes you a lot easier to become a transgressor.
Right.
Right. And here he kind of, for the next section of things fall apart, and here's where we get to the point. It's like, well, who are we supposed to blame when things are bad? Like who are we supposed to point to as the cause? And he uses the Jews as the example in the Bible, and he kind of points out to this pattern, which anyone who's watched his Maps of Meaning lectures or read his Maps of Meaning will pick up very quickly. It's that the Jews who essentially make a covenant with Yahweh, and then through good leadership establish a society, and then that society grows into an empire, and as it grows more and more and becomes more and more successful, they become complacent. And as they're becoming complacent, because there isn't as much competition, sin starts to grow, the system starts to kind of get shaky. A prophet shows up and tells them, hey, you're not following God's word, you're forgetting the orphans and the widows, you're not doing what we're supposed to be doing, what this whole thing was set up for. They normally don't heed the prophet's warning, or they don't do it on time. The whole system collapses, all the people are punished. And every time that story is told, that's a general outline of multiple stories, every time that story is told, the Hebrews repent at length and see themselves as failing, as we're the ones that failed. We didn't live the way God intended us to live, right? And from a little bit of the Maps of Meaning thing, God here is the ultimate ideal that was held at the top, that the entire group agreed to aim to, right? It's like, if we're not following those rules anymore, the system can't sustain itself, because we're not all moving in the same direction and united by this value. And he then points out that cycle of, and then once they do that, they slowly start to rebuild the state again. And it's cyclical. It's a constant cycle of establishing a covenant, a value structure, following that, having it be successful. Because it's so successful, naturally people stop caring about the covenant because things are already working, and then it collapses. And it's just this cyclical point. And that's also where he brings New Orleans. I don't know if anyone wanted to explain that.
I was going to address this in my talking points. I do have a little problems. Should I wait until my thing later, or should I jump into it now?
It's up to you. Yeah.
Okay. So one problem I have with Peterson is he talks about New Orleans and that it failed to take precautions under the Flood Act of 1965. And he said that other places had also had levees that were in disrepair, and that it was sort of, he kind of blames.
Can you explain this point first, and then jump in so people know what we're talking about?
The willful blindness.
Yeah, the idea that like we all have to kind of take responsibility as a society for what happens to us collectively, I guess was his point here. And he said, I think he points, I forgot where else, but he points out another place where they had the same exact levee situation.
Dutch, yeah.
And it was the Dutch? Okay.
Yeah.
And they like jumped upon it and they fixed it. And if they had had a storm such as New Orleans, then that kind of disaster would not have happened there. I do push back a little bit here, because I say, whose fault is it? Is it the elected officials? Is it the politics? This Flood Act was passed in 1965. And I'm like, well, what about the kids that were living there and they weren't even born when that act was passed? Do they have responsibility? Does the guy who pays his mortgage on time every day and, has a very clean and proper home, but just isn't involved in local politics, is he responsible? So that is like a gray area for me, where this seems like a very kind of political issue where elected officials should be in charge, and how much culpability really comes down to the individual citizen. So I don't know how much invested I am in that, at least in the New Orleans example.
Right. Yeah, because I think the point he's trying to make is kind of similar to the one he makes about Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And it's the idea that if an individual takes responsibility, there's an emanating effect that has. And kind of what he's trying to point out on that one, I believe, is, look, the Dutch prepared their levees for a storm, the biggest storm in 1,000 years, right? And it's like, New Orleans, did we know that it could be flooded? Yes. Did we know it was possible that this could happen? Yes. Did we know that sea levels were rising, temperatures were rising, and and that climate change was increasing the probability that this was a likely occurrence? Yes. And then his point is, but look at the system that was currently in place. It's like, it was meant in 1965 to be done, but it was supposed to be finished by 1978. 40 years later, it was only 60% done. And what he's pointing to is more, like we mentioned about the Hebrews, is like, it's the collapse of the system because the people are starting to deviate from the value that set that system up, right?
My question, comparing this to the Hebrew tradition in that sense, if let's just say, like, the people in New Orleans were doing the right thing, they were paying their mortgages and everything was going fine, but there was something unknown to them, and perhaps that's something higher up in the government, because we know in the US, we have to go through Congress and we have a federal system. So even if you've got really on point local officials, if the money's not coming in from the federal system, like, where does that culpability come from? Is it just that the people of New Orleans were delinquent and corrupt and just aloof to what was going on? Or
I think that, to me, it's in exactly that question that lies the answer, which is that life is going to be exceptionally unfair. Like, the culpability is always going to lie in the people themselves or but that's not the point. Like, he ends that section and he says, if you are suffering, well, that's the norm. Like, there are always going to be unfair actors that are taking control in that situation. But if you're going to be corrupted by that suffering, if you're going to take that and point fingers at someone else, that's the stuff you have control over. And that's, I think, is the only place he wants to really play ball.
Well, I mean, in that case, you should point fingers at somebody, because you don't want that to happen again. You have to be able to, like, look back and be like, well, you kind of failed us on this front, and then not in a punitive way, but in a way that you're kind of protecting your own house by pointing out the arsonist who burned down your house so he doesn't do it again.
Right. And I don't think he's saying, like, I don't think he's directly putting blame on anyone. I think he's more pointing to the failure of the entire system as a whole. And the idea is, look, we passed a law that was supposed to take care of this. It never got done. Why didn't it happen? Oh, well, because corruption set in, which is the same effect of any system that's old and that needs to be revilified, right? It's also the Horus Osiris myth that he always talks about, is the idea that any system, while it's running, needs to constantly be updated. Otherwise, it starts to deteriorate. We're constantly living in the bodies of our ancestors, mythologically speaking, right? Like, everything that was already built was built by people that were dead. And unless we revilify it and revamp it, it'll slowly just start to decay. And this is more what he's pointing to, is, look, 40 years later, they barely got more than half of it done. And because of this mistake, regardless of what it is, right, as a system as a whole, it failed. And kind of what he then brings this back to is like the Hebrews saw reality in this sense. They saw it as axiomatic. The goodness of God, or if you don't want to perceive it that way, the goodness of reality is axiomatic. If you do the correct things, good things will happen. Or if you do certain things, good things will happen. If you do not do those things, bad things will happen, right? And that's where this conceptualization of axioms that dictate the future comes from, which is how they conceptualize it as worshiping of Yahweh.
I think that there's another really important point to this too, is the idea of resilience. right? If you're blaming other people, you're not going to be resilient. So nobody has been in the history of the world has been persecuted more than the Jews, right? So you can go over, the Crusades, Nazism, Russia, but if they were constantly seeking revenge, they would not exist as a people. So that they actually they take the higher road, because remember, it's self-destructive, not only to yourself but to others if you do seek revenge. So in order to survive as a people, you can't take vengeance. And that's the amazing thing about Jewish people in general. The culture would have never survived if it had taken the approach of the Penzance or I forget, the Columbine shooters, whomever. If they took that perspective on the world, well, then they wouldn't exist. So they would turn in on themselves and kill themselves as well as other people. So they've had to take the high road, and that high road has enabled them to survive.
I want to say something though, and yes, I agree with you, Joe. This is not about revenge, but I don't think that it's 100% inward like in the 20th century. Like there's a lot of Jewish advocacy that goes on about the Holocaust and preventing this from happening and petitioning to the UN about human rights. So it's not like, okay, let's just get our act in order and move on. There is a lot of outward movement and a lot of outward work that goes on to kind of prevent things like this from happening again. So yeah, I agree with you that revenge is definitely not a good way of going it. And again, when you're pointing out that someone dropped the ball, it's not in a punitive way. It's just in a way to prevent it from happening again.
And the prevention is part of that's the important part, is that they're creating an awareness for it. So they're actually not, so when they say never again, it's not just never again to themselves. It's never again for other people as well. So what they're bringing and that's an extremely virtuous way of looking at the world, because I'm sorry.
Oh, no.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead.
Oh, no. I was just saying that's a virtuous way of looking at the world, because you're bringing awareness. You're not cursing God. You're not cursing other people. You're actually, you're right. They're taking the initiative to show, that this is but that's the high road, because they have every right to be angry, but yet they're taking the high road. So, but that goes to their existence.
It's to the point of Peterson where for the transformation, right? To adapt to a way where this will not happen to you again, and that's the motif of never again, right? Like we need to become better so that this can never happen to anyone, right? All right, and then this is where he finally does get to the point of, all right, so if you are suffering, that's life. That's what that's what's going to happen to all of us. Everyone is always suffering. But if it's unbearable, as Claire alluded to earlier, it's like, then here's some things that you can do. And this part's going to be a little bit hard because it's a lot of things. So I don't know if, Claire, did you want to, would you like to cover this? Would you like to go through it?
I don't know. What do you think? You want to go through it? You want to read it? I don't care.
I picked a couple of mine, but if you want, we can each go and pick a couple of the strategies that he thought that you guys thought were important.
Yeah, let's do it. You want to start?
Yeah, I'll start us off. But some of the things that Peterson says is essentially, look, if you're feeling like life is completely meaningless, if you're starting to lose hope, there's a couple of things that you might be able to do to actually build that back up. And one of them is ask yourself these questions and truly try to explore these. Have you taken full advantage of the opportunities that you currently have? Have you made peace with your family? Something that I've recently started doing. And do you treat your spouse and children with dignity? those were my three big ones, like reestablishing of family values and more importantly, familiar relationships, because that's gives you a great support system that then allows you to start to lean on other people, which, you know, naturally is going to help you psychologically.
Yeah, he also says, have you cleaned up your life? If the answer is no, here's something to try. Start to stop doing what you know to be wrong. Start stopping today. Don't waste time questioning how you know what you're doing is wrong. You can know that something is wrong or right without knowing why. Your entire being can tell you something that you can neither explain nor articulate. I think that this one is really important, because if you just start listening to yourself and stopping to do the things that you know to be wrong, or just those things that start to feel uncomfortable, that can equate very quickly to cleaning up your life. So we're going to start talking the next couple of weeks about telling truth. That's a really important element of this. But I think this idea of start to stop doing what you know to be wrong and start stopping today. Like, it's so simple. And once you stop doing these little micro lies and little micro wrongdoings, it's really so therapeutic. So I think that's one that really sticks with me.
And Aaron or Joe, did you guys want to add on to that? Or if not, we can keep going. You're both on mute.
Could I get into my final thoughts, or?
Oh, yeah. Let me just wrap this up then, because
Okay.
just a couple, because I did want to jump on to Claire's point about start. It's kind of a weird sentence, was like start to stop doing what you know to be wrong. And what he points out here is that you can use, what I really like is like that you can use your own moral judgment. In other words, he's not telling you what you should define as right or wrong. In fact, he's telling you you shouldn't even bother to try to argue with yourself about that. It's like when you're about to do something and you feel like it's something you shouldn't do, don't do it. And the idea is like that intuition is likely more your real self than you trying to rationalize through it. And I've done things that I know I shouldn't have done. And it's mostly because I knew I shouldn't have done it. I stopped and then started thinking about why I should and shouldn't, and was able to find a loophole that allowed me to be okay with doing it. And I'm like, well, you know, like, and then I ended up doing it, even though the initial impulse is like, come on, man, you know you shouldn't be doing this, right? And his point is, look, we are all constantly doing this. Listen to that first intuition. Listen to that first thing that stops you. And then from there, he kind of finally brings it home saying, and have humility. If your own life isn't organized, if you don't have your stuff together, if you haven't sorted yourself out, what makes you think that you're the sort of person that can rule a city when you can barely, rule yourself? And that's where he starts to bring this to the idea of, but if you start to do these things, if you start to tell people around you, you'll start to tell people around you what you really need. You'll start to correct your own mistakes. You'll experience improvements because you've began to remove inauthentic actions. In other words, things that you were lying to yourself about. You'll start to be less bitter, and you'll start to see what mistakes you're making. You'll begin to explore your past. You'll start to feel stronger and less bitter. You'll move more confidently into the future. And once you start to do that, he makes the point that you will remove the self-induced tragedies that burden you, and will be more prepared to bear the inevitable tragedies that life requires. It's like, and if you get to that point, then you might start to see that your soul has become less corrupt, and that you may start to see existence as a genuine good, even in the face of your own vulnerability and mortality. And if you get to that point, his final idea is, and maybe you'll start to see just how much potential human beings have if every one of us did this. And the idea that like we have no idea what that would actually look like. And he ends it with, set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. And so now I do want to hand it over to Aaron to give some of his additional ideas on this chapter.
Okay, thank you, Roger. Really well said. A lot of the stuff we already mentioned here. Let's see here. Okay, so my biggest issue here is when exactly can you say that your house is in order? And I 110% agree with Peterson that if you don't have your life in order, you can't be telling others what to do. It's impossible. I wish there was a little bit more criteria as to what constitutes a cleaned room. Does it mean that you have no drug use? Does it mean that you have a good income? Does it mean that you get along perfectly with your family, that you have no debts that are paid? I do think that within the evolution of people, there does come a time, like with the New Orleans example and with other larger societal things, where you do need to step up and you are in a position where you have learned a thing or two, and that it's incumbent upon you to speak up and start directing your finger outward. So I think thinking about what exactly should be the criteria where you can look yourself in the mirror and say that your life is in order is something that I think is definitely worthy of talking about in the discussion groups. A lot of the stuff we addressed, I think this was also mentioned in the chat, was the idea of Solzhenitsyn versus Tolstoy. Both of them are like Russian authors. They lived some years apart from one another, but they both went under some pretty hardcore stuff. And there is this question is, why does Solzhenitsyn go to the gulag for all of these years? He's tortured and lives under these like terrible conditions. But he still has like a positive outlook, whereas someone like Tolstoy, who maybe even had a slightly softer life, kind of develops this very pessimistic outlook. And I think we can connect this to the people that are abused in childhood. Why do some of them go on to be abusers themselves, but most don't, and most go on to be loving human beings? So I think that there are some like individual questions that are kind of sprinkled in with some broader trends here of how society functions. And like I said, I think that for some of you guys, the road from nihilism to being a mass shooter or a genocidal maniac is a very huge leap. I know for me, for a long time, that was a huge leap, but you know, I've kind of met people like this before who had a very nihilistic kind of personality to them, and it would sort of lead them to to commit petty crimes and sort of just kind of have a reckless disregard for humanity. I think when you sort of believe that everything is inherently useless or has no value, you kind of your main goal is to just seek pleasure for yourself. And you might be smart enough, if you're a really intelligent person, you know how to skirt the law. But once the law no longer becomes a problem for you, it's just a question of how, like, everything I do has no consequence in the grand scheme. So how can I benefit myself the most? And I think that's the natural progression of how we go from just adopting a nihilistic philosophy to eventually becoming a mass shooter. Most people will not make it all the way to the far end. You can be a nihilist but not become a mass shooter. But it kind of, in my experience, invites the door open for some pretty pessimistic thinking and actions. That's about it. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Joe, wanna? Yeah.
Yeah,
go ahead,
just
Joe.
really quickly. And I know we're running a little bit late, so I'll be brief. You know, I think that there's two important things that you know, Peterson is pointing out here. We can either hate what happened to us, or we could hate other people and blame other people for what happened to us, and let that, you know, turn into a act of evil. But I think that there are two virtues that are critical to overcoming this, and that's courage and justice. And the sense that courage, in the fact that we can actually take what has happened to us and turn it into something better. And so that we're not going to allow some of those things to define us, that we'll actually be, we can take on all the circumstances that we've been in, and in order to see a better path. And justice, in the sense that, justice means that you wouldn't be seeking revenge, you wouldn't seek vengeance. So the idea, these two virtues are critical, I find, to the entire process of the entire point of becoming a better person in the face of such adversity. There's actually, and one last thing I'll just leave it with is, there's a end of the quote with Marcus Aurelius is, meditation is not to meddle with other people's affairs and not to listen to slander. And that's a really important point, because if you're not going to listen to slander, then why would you give into it? So I think that's, it's more put yourself in order, and then, the rest of the world will take care of itself.
All right, thank you. Claire, any final thoughts?
No, I think you guys have all hit it beautifully.
All right. Shrikant?
Yes, so we are off to Q&A section. Let me remind everybody that we've got 4 rules that we have used for the past 4 years to make possible really complex exchange like this. Number 1, raise your hand when you want to speak. The way you do that here, type in !Q, or put your question there, starting with the Q or exclamation mark, or you can raise your hand in Zoom. So that's rule number 1. Rule number 2, keep on topic. Rule number 3, be brief. And rule 4, be courteous. All right, so with that, it's going to be Shelley, followed by Stephen P., Sanjay, Jean, Deborah, and Marina. Next one, and then Stephen Thomas. Shelley, give me just a second. Let me allow this. Okay, Shelley, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. And this has been a really interesting discussion, and I appreciate all y'all's points of view. My question goes back to the New Orleans thing, and was he really telling the story to be that detailed, or was it really just the point that he was making, which I've been listening to Peterson for a number of years now, and it's just the idea of self-examination, right? No matter what happens, like, look at yourself first and say, okay, is there anything I could have done? Was that the point he was making, or was there some other point that was in the details of New Orleans and the flooding?
Yeah, I think, well, I mean, yeah, there's always a hard part to understand what his point was without having him here, right? But the way I understood it was, the main point that he brings that story in is, he puts it right in between talking about the Hebrews and their way of adapting and creating a society. And then right after that kind of goes back to the Hebrews, kind of pointing out that their perspective of reality or of God was axiomatic. So then you follow these rules and things will go good, right? These are these virtues and values. You don't follow these virtues and values, things will start to deteriorate and collapse. And what he's kind of pointing out to is, like, look, a good example of this is, it was willful blindness that happened. We knew that was possible of happening. We knew it could come, and likely would at some point come. We passed the law that said we were going to take care of this problem. No one ever enforced it. It never got done. Right? We can, and at Taryn's point, it's like, yeah, but, and there's obviously someone that's guilty, or multiple people that are guilty. It's like, yes, but from a full systemic point of view, the system itself isn't functioning the way it's supposed to, and it's not functioning, and it's not getting the things that's supposed to get done right anymore. It's starting to fail in its own values.
And that's because of the people, is the point, right? Is because individual people that were part of the state, part of the conglomerate, and therefore this is why it's so important for us to look to ourselves, because we play a very significant role in the group effort to prevent these kinds of things from happening. And so we don't need to take lightly our part in it, no matter how seemingly small that part may be. That's kind of what I get from that.
Yeah, very well put, because essentially that's his main point, right? Is that, like, for New Orleans to happen, there had to have been lots and lots of people who justified it as, well, it's not, I'm just going to take some money from here, and it's not that big of a deal, right? But it's when that starts to become very common, that's what starts to deteriorate the entire system.
Yeah.
Aaron, you want to jump in?
Yeah, just a quick thing. I 100% agree with his societal commentary. I think it was just maybe if he had just used a different analogy, it would have worked a little bit better. If he had just talked about like the increasing crime rate or a poor public school system, or how, like if he had just picked another issue that that is more visible to the common person, then I'd be like, right on, Jordan. Like we all see that, but we're all ignoring it. I guess it was just that particular analogy that I'm kind of scratching my head on.
Okay, next up is Stephen P. Go ahead, Stephen. Stephen, you need to unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you. I guess this is for Aaron. He was mentioning about self-love, and I wanted to discuss what would be the difference between narcissistic self-love and healthy self-love.
That's a very good question, Stephen. I don't think the narcissist loves him or herself. I think that they are drawn to attention, and that is a deep-rooted sense of insecurity that causes them to profess that they love themselves, but they really don't. They're just insecure about themselves, so they take all of these actions and thwart the well-being of others to benefit themselves. But deep inside, I don't think they truly have a love of themselves. I think this is all just to kind of satisfy like a scratch of like feeling insecure about themselves. Does that answer your question?
Part one, and then part two, what would be some of the characteristics of a healthy self-love?
I think that it would be that you would be able to accomplish things without necessarily adulation and the attention that a narcissist seeks. Like a narcissist seeks a lot of attention. So if you loved yourself, you could go to the gym and work out and just feel good about yourself. Whereas the narcissist is going to go to the gym and take all these selfies of him or herself. And look guys, I'm going to the gym. So I think that someone who has self-love can do these things quietly and just love themselves for it, whereas the narcissist would seek attention at all times.
Can I just add to that? I think there's one other element too. There's self-forgiveness, is that you have to be able to forgive yourself. And that's a form of self-love as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is Sanjay. Sanjay, go ahead.
Yes. So I'm, going back to Peterson's original idea that, how we behave and getting our own house in order is important, because that's one of the ways that we make sure that bad things don't happen, that the world is a good place, a safe place, etc. And in theory, I think that's correct, but there's a part of that I think is a little more complicated. And so I'll take the let's say that we're able to do that, and everybody is able to do exactly what Peterson says, and humanity becomes wonderful, and everybody does all of the right things. I don't think that's going to ultimately result in what Peterson, suggests the reason for doing this, because, even then, random events will happen in the world, aspects of entropy, in the universe. So there will be problems and quote unquote harm. It will not be caused by humans, but that will naturally occur. So I think two outcomes of what he's saying, or two reasons why what he's saying isn't enough, is that we should not assume that just because humanity becomes perfect, that the world will become perfect. I don't think that it will. I think that it will only become neutral at that point. And second thing is that we should not assume that harm is only intentional. I think that there are many behaviors that people perform, or groups perform, and they cannot know the ramifications of the harm that will come out of that. So I think that all we can do is I agree with what he's saying, that we need to do this, but I don't think that's going to eliminate harm or serious problems. What anyone with comments? I'd like to just hear comments on that.
I mean, I just think from one perspective is that if you're putting your own house in order, and if everybody's doing that, well, then it will be better. So that's now, obviously, that's the ideal, and that's not going to happen, and that's not reality. I understand that. But I think that that's the point of the chapter, in a way, is that it is professing a certain amount of self-reflection. And while everybody may not be willing to do that, and may not have the courage to do that, as many people as possible doing it, I guess, is what we could shoot for.
Yeah.
Joe, just if I can clarify, I mean, the point that I made was that, let's say that in the world, everybody does do exactly what Peterson is saying. What I'm saying is that even then, that will not eliminate serious problems, because they can happen for random reasons, and two reasons I gave. Random reasons is
there's unintentional consequences, absolutely.
Right, but I also don't think that's his claim. His claim much more has to do with this is kind of what he always circles around, where it's like there's two kinds of suffering in life. There's the kind that's just kind of like the fee of the ticket, right? Like the price you pay to live is that you die. It's that every single person you love dies. It's that every single person you love and you suffer, right? And the entire way. A lot of times by mistake, a lot of times by chance, a lot of times unintended. But then he points out, but on top of that, there's additional suffering. That's the unnecessary, intentional suffering. I think even in the video Shrikant shared where he says, maybe you make a mistake, all right, and you didn't know. Well, sure, that's just ignorance. It's like, but malice, I think he says malice is when you know you shouldn't do something and then still choose to do it. And that's what he's saying. If we can address the things where we shoot ourselves in the foot, then maybe we would become strong enough to handle the things we would have to handle, which are the suffering that you're talking about, the dragon of chaos, all the worldly issues, all the issues where miscommunication and mistakes happen.
Next up is going to be Jean, Deborah, Marina, and Stephen T. Jean, go ahead.
Yeah, I also want to discuss about that. You put your house in perfect order, then the world will be better. So actually, it's an interesting story I want to share, because I have two kids, and the school need a lot of PTSA work, and I have my own business, so I'm actually pretty busy but flexible. So I try to do some work at school, and then my husband said, "No, let the stay-home mom doing it. They have more time." But to my surprise, I found majority of PTSA moms are actually working moms, and there are a couple of them are stay-home mom, but majority are not. So which is, I'm sure those people, their house are not in perfect order based on my experience. But the people who actually have their house perfect order, who didn't have the time to go out to help the school. So that's just one example to show. And I also see people actually work for the city council, and they spend so much time with the city. They don't really have a lot of time for their own house or their kids sometimes. That's why some people have to quit, because their kids are not doing so well when they spend so much time with the school. So that's just some example to show it's not always the case.
Thank you. Does anybody want to comment?
Oh, yeah, this isn't, he's not saying this as a fact. He's saying this as a recommendation, right? Like, as he says with all these rules, like, you don't have to do any of these. It's like, my point is, if you do them, you'll be better off. And the idea is, for him, also going to Aaron's comment real quick, was the idea of like, well, when is your house in perfect order? And what Peterson just kind of notes is like, well, it's more a matter of building the competence. It's almost a stoic idea of you slowly build your competence until you're competent enough to take bigger things on. So if you don't even have your room or your house in order, your ability isn't quite well enough to handle other things. But once you have your house in order, you can start to expand beyond that domain to your local community, maybe to your local government. And once you can manage that, you slowly start to expand to those. And that's, I mean, to some extent, you see this even with politicians, right? A lot of politicians start small, start with the mayor of a city, and then move to senator, governors, and then run for president. It's like, it's a building of a skill set. And that's more what he's saying is valuable and will add value.
Thank you. Next up is Deborah. Deborah, go ahead.
Okay, hi. So I'm not very familiar with this. I haven't read the book. I don't really in the chapter. So I'm just basing this on what you guys were describing. And it's kind of like what Jean was saying. I guess I'll just kind of branch off of that. I agree. I feel like trying to live ethically and like, I don't know, maybe not being perfect basically, but like, I don't know, like liking yourself, I guess, doesn't mean that everything's in perfect order. So in terms of the people who, let's say, have had some sort of trauma visited on them, like, I don't know. I mean, the issue of like vengeance is maybe like a separate thing, but this idea, maybe it has like traumatized you. Maybe it's affected you in ways that are not always positive. So like, would he say you're not supposed to call out other injustices because like you're dealing with your own stuff? Like, what if you have specific experiences that mirror those you see in society or with people you interact with? Like, basically, you've gone through something. You don't. I wouldn't say that you're obligated to reach out to people or to do something to change that necessarily. But like, if you feel that like that could help someone, I don't know that the world is better off for you not doing that. So I don't know. What would he say to something like that? I guess.
Yeah. So I think he would say, I mean, it depends on the circumstances, right? Like it's, but I would say again, it's not this idea where it's like, it's a yes or no kind of thing. It's more a matter of like, look, the main reason he wrote this is one, to explain and help people with nihilism. That's like, look, if you're going down the path where you're hating into all of your life and everything is terrible, before you pick up a gun and go to your school and say, you know what, I'm the judge of this and everything is shit, right? Like you actually pull it back and be like, well, hold on, how much of this is your fault? How much, right? You analyze your situation. But what I think it gets misconstrued as is this idea of, well, that if I don't have my room perfectly clean, does that now mean I can't say anything when I see something bad in the world, right? And I would say even at the end of this chapter, he kind of points to this idea of like, one of the ways that you can add value to your life is by speaking your truth, is by saying things that you need to say. Like that if anything is more emboldening. I don't think he would necessarily say like, you should just not say anything because you haven't, set your life or house in order.
But like, if you take violent actions like that, is that criticizing? I feel like that's a different thing entirely. Like, I think a bunch of people. I don't know.
So no. So I think when he means criticizing, he means systems, not just action. So like, yeah, like if someone had abused you in some way and you see that abuse, yeah, of course, calling that out is going to be naturally a good thing. That's kind of like I think Joe was talking about, a mother that grew up with an abusive, or a client that grew up with an abusive mother sees why that abuse is, extremely harmful, and chooses to change that in her own life and not have her child live through that same process.
Okay, next up is Marina, Stephen, T, Keishon, and Robert. Marina, go ahead.
So a few things. First of all, putting Tolstoy and Solzhenitsyn in the same sentence is like putting Shakespeare and Assange. Just so you know, that's a cultural reference. And I know what I'm talking about, because Solzhenitsyn used to live in Vermont for a while when he was exiled, and I met him a few times. I have not met Tolstoy, but I'm just telling you that it's approximately the same as putting Shakespeare and Assange in the same sentence, especially since it's been proven that Solzhenitsyn actually stole his stories from his fellow prisoners. That's number one. Number two, I actually disagree with Aaron and agree with Peterson about the New Orleans, because if people, yes, I'm sure there were some people who were not born when the corruption was happening and the money being stolen, blah, blah, blah. But and if they're adults now, they could have moved out of New Orleans. They didn't have to live there. So they did make a choice. I forgot who said it, but there is a very famous saying that we deserve the government that we get, because we do vote, we do prioritize things. Everybody always finds time to go out to a restaurant or to go out for a drink or to watch their favorite movie or serial or whatever it is they watch. But voting, they don't have time. They're too busy with other things. Going to a gym is more important than go to vote. I've had that argument with many, many Americans.
Marina, let me just say, I agree with you. Like, I think that high levels of civic engagement are absolutely necessary. I'm definitely not opposing that. I was just saying that in the case of New Orleans, the law was probably a law that was not well known. People didn't know if it was being funded properly. Corruption also has a way of covering things up. So you might be a very good citizen, but you might be being lied to by the system around you, whereas something like a high crime rate or something like a poor education system is a lot more visible. Like if there's a lot of trash on your sidewalk, that's something that you see every single day, and that's something you can address. Something like the levees and a hurricane is probably just outside the scope of what the average person knows. That's kind of where I'm coming at. I'm not saying that that absolves individuals from their responsibility.
Okay,
Not knowing does not necessarily gives you the right not to follow it, first of all. Second of all, everybody is aware of corruption everywhere, including in this country. So if you don't know it, it means you did not look deeply enough. And my last comment I wanted to make is, you don't necessarily have to have a spotless house to participate in civic engagement by voting and doing other things.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead. Move on. You can. The only thing I'm going to say is that, like, I want to say that, like, if someone doesn't know something, it's just a lot harder to hold them responsible for that. You know, we want to hold people responsible for the things that they see on a daily basis, but I think just pointing the finger and be like, you should have known that, is just, it's a hard case to make, you know, especially when it's something like an obscure law from 1965. It's just not the easiest case to make.
Okay, next up is Stefan T. Go ahead, Stefan.
Thank you, and I appreciate this whole presentation. Thank you guys for putting this on. I've enjoyed a lot of the comments. Mariana, who just spoke, I really appreciate your personal experience with Solzhenitsyn and Assange. And I think that telling other people's stories is important, but I do get the idea that Tolstoy and Solzhenitsyn are two different people. I get that. And thank you for sharing that. That helps me a little bit more clear. I really appreciate all the comments here. I appreciate some things that, that Shelley said about details. And Roger, to me, has given the answer here. And let me just say that the first 10 pages of this chapter are there for people to engage intellectually. The answer, the part that if I take anything away from chapter 6, it's pages 157, 158, and 159. In other words, the very essence of social responsibility, the very essence of social accountability, the very essence of political accountability is stopping. In other words, I don't have to have a clean kitchen. What I have to have is be engaged in the process of cleaning the kitchen. And when I am consciously focused on syntropy, the syntropy of cleaning my kitchen, I get out of the entropy, I get into personal responsibility and accountability, and I start seeing it in other people. I'm convinced that Jordan Peterson is absolutely right, that if every human being just started to stop and just became aware of self-stopping, that suddenly I would see other people who are starting to stop, and I'd recognize great politicians because they're stopping. This is not about fixing the world. This is about being in touch with my reality and the mess I make every freaking day. And the way to step out of entropy, the way to step out of chaos, is to start stopping. I honestly, throw away the first 10 pages of this chapter, read page 157 through 159, get rid of all of the critical intellectual arguments relating to vengeance and justice and mercy, and just focus on stopping, and we've got Jordan Peterson's message. And the world will be a better place immediately, because when I start stopping, I see other people who are stopping, and I say, hey, we're stopping together, and pretty soon it gets contagious. And when that hits critical mass, bam, our politicians suddenly would be into stopping instead of being into try to fix something outside of them. That's my point. I'm so grateful for you guys and what you're presenting here. Thank you very much.
Stefan, that was amazing. That was amazing. I want to invite you to join the panel on one of the following rules. We've got places for rule 8, 9, 11, and 12. So just send me a message. Would you like to do that?
I'd love to do that.
Which is your favorite rule?
What's that?
What rule would you like? 8, 9?
Whatever one. Let me look at it. Why don't you, if you'll post which ones are open, I'll look at them and be glad to respond.
Sounds good. 8, 9, 11, and 12 are open. And folks, this is an open invitation for everybody. Okay, if you really have spent time looking at Jordan Peterson's thought, then we want to hear from you as a panelist. So just get in touch with me, and we'll schedule it. So let me see. Next up is Kishan, followed by Robert D. Kishan, go ahead.
Yes, it's good to be here, good to be alive, and in the mix with you all. I send greetings of peace, shalom, salam, and blessings from the Almighty Creator to you all. And before I ask my conclusive question, I would first like to add just 3 particles of theological precepts or viewpoints.
Kishan, we need to be short because we are going to go into discussion groups. And if you want to give your take, I'll give you 2 minutes during the takeaway section. Why don't you ask just your question now, and you can talk about what you have to say in the takeaway session.
Okay.
So go ahead and ask your question, sir.
Well, both with minutes. My is how do you individual?
Sorry, Kishan, you're breaking up. We can't hear you. Can you type your question in the chat, and I will read it out for you. Kishan, please type your question in the chat, and I will read it out for you because we are not able to hear it. Okay, we're going to go. Next up is going to be Robert. Robert, go ahead.
So I was wondering how useful it is to really consider some of the writings or ideas in general of some of these people that we discussed, mass murderers, other people that commit these pretty horrible crimes, as representing their actual thoughts and beliefs. So I guess my question is, if we found out, for example, like if that the Columbine shooters or other people that have committed these crimes were misrepresenting their own thinking, either deliberately, they were trying to trick the world or troll the world as part of, in addition to their crime, or just because they didn't have a lot of insight into how they thought, how would that affect some of the insights that Jordan Peterson had that we discussed in this chapter?
I think I can kind of jump in there. I think that in some way, I haven't read the Columbine shooters, but I know of like Elliot Rodgers, another mass shooter. These people kind of have they are delusional. Like at some level, they are delusional. Like they don't fully acknowledge that they are outward narcissists and that they don't actually self-actualize that. So they have a grandiose theory that like, I am the only virtuous man left on the face of the earth, and I am here to basically purge the world of all evil. So if you read their manifestos, in their warped view of the world, they are the saviors and everyone else is evil. What Peterson is saying that they are kind of adapting this fake mythos to sort of justify their nihilism. They may be aware or they're unaware that they're nihilistic and that they secretly harbor a hatred of humanity. So I think they are delusional and they are not representing themselves outwardly correctly.
Yeah, and just to add to that, because I did read the Columbine one, and I would have to just kind of second what Aaron essentially just said, is that, well, one, I don't think you could say that they weren't nihilistic after the actions that they do, right? Like to just be not just willing, but purposely aiming to destroy the most innocent version of life that they can find, kind of implies a complete disregard for life, which is essentially Peterson's point. And I guess, yeah, like I think it would be a much bigger problem if it was like an association to Nazis or sexism or racism or some reason justification for why they did it. But Peterson's more just pointing to, in order to even pull this off, the view of what you think life is and what you think your own existence is has to be such that you see life in such a way that it should just be snuffed out, and that's actually almost a moral claim that they make, right? So it's more of just like their actions laid on top of what they've already written that kind of seems to match.
Okay, I'm going to read out the question from Kishan. He has typed it. What are some effective ways to respond to slanderous speech and logical fallacies?
I always tend to find if you point it out, I mean, if it's slanderous in the point where they're just attacking you or attacking someone and they already have their mindset up, you're likely not gonna change anyone's mind. So for example, like with Peterson, if you already have a view of, I don't know, him being every single insult you can think of, there's probably nothing I can say that's going to change your mind. Like, that's already set in stone. That's not going to change. If they're coming out of, well, this is what I've heard, this is what I've understood, simply giving it your point of view. And for me, not placing it as the end all be all, but rather being like, look, here's how I understand it. Plenty of other resources. I would suggest checking out these, right? But at the same time, not just trying to counter them by saying, it's like, I'm right, here's why you should believe me. As for logical fallacies, I always like just pointing out the logical fallacy and then using an example that makes the exact opposite case of what they're making. Because with logical fallacies, normally you can very easily do that. You can just take whatever point you want to make and then just make assumptions, and then you can get to that same point.
Okay.
For both of these, I like to just give my own personal experience dealing with it. So when that thing happened, I felt this. When A happened, I felt B. And I find anything farther than going from that, you're going to be kind of projecting on someone's own opinion of themselves. But I think, as Roger's saying, getting to that causal story. So A happened and B was the result, or B is the result for more than one people, is even more effective.
I'll just really quickly to the point of slander is that you don't go down to the level that somebody's slandering, because you don't let them take your virtue from you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, folks. So we're going to do breakout rooms for about 25 minutes, and then we're going to come back and everybody gets about 2 minutes to talk about their takeaways.